We're now joined by former BBC royal correspondent Michael Cole. Michael, very good evening to you. Welcome to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. I mean, it's hard to imagine how much the BBC tried to keep this all quiet. You know, it's easy for people to judge in retrospect, and I know that hindsight is a brilliant thing. But, I mean, surely the least the BBC should have done was, knowing that this uncovered horrific situation was now wide open, that they should have then done their level best to try and find out themselves, surely, what had been going on and who had been responsible, instead of which they've sort of tried to stop it.
Michael, this whole affair stinks to high heaven. And that stench is going to follow the BBC into the negotiations for the renewal of the Royal Charter by which it lives in 2027. Unless it deals with it and goes the hangout route, shows some of the transparency it's always talking about, and deals with it honestly and with integrity. There is a tremendous difference between issuing redacted pages, some of them whole pages redacted, names, whole sentences. That is not the way to deal with this. The thing couldn't be worse if they actually made everything public. A few people might have been embarrassed, but what we're talking about here is the integrity, the reputation, and the future of the BBC. And you know, Mike, who I think about at this moment? Matt Wiesler. He was a South African talented director and creator of online documents. And he was ordered by Bashir to create fraudulently the fake bank statements which Bashir used to get into the confidence of Princess Diana. Now, when that came out, Wiesler, was blamed, although he was following Bashir's orders. The BBC, without him knowing it, blacklisted him. He had no work. His life was ruined. He had to leave his home. He was one of the casualties. But the big casualty in this is the truth and the reputation of the BBC. And to hear Martin Bashir playing the race card today, well, I'm afraid it just smacks of desperation when you realize what has gone on. This is the worst scandal that the BBC has ever encountered. And if it doesn't deal with it now, it will pay the price. It has already paid it when you read out those poll figures about people trusting the BBC. Well, you know, it breaks my heart. I worked for the BBC for more than 20 years, more than a fifth of its existence. And everywhere I went around the world, it was respected for its integrity, for its honesty, for its plain dealing. Well, that is not the case now, and that goes right to the top. And another thing, Mike, which your previous correspondent didn't talk about, the man who's actually pushed this forward, Andy Webb, on the 20th anniversary of the now infamous interview with Princess Diana, the BBC ran a program, a self-congratulatory program, which said how wonderful they'd been to get this great scoop. I remember watching it. There was Tony Hall, the head of news and current affairs, talking about going down to this secret hotel room in Eastbourne and watching the rough cut of the film and walking on the beach with his acolytes saying, "Isn't it fantastic? Did she really say that? Isn't it amazing?" Those people were congratulating themselves only 8 years ago. And then it all came out, and we had Lord Dyson's report, which made the matter clear how much trickery, chicanery, and dishonesty there had been in the obtaining of that interview.
Yes, it is extraordinary, isn't it? And of course, we've now got to the point where William, the future king and the current Prince of Wales, has said that he never wants them to show that interview again. I presume they won't be stupid enough to do that. But clearly, Bashir is a very troubled individual because, you know, he comes across as a man who will literally say anything to get out of a jam.
Well, I knew him quite well. I knew him before he became famous or infamous. He used to haunt my office. He was working on another story and he thought I had information that he could use. And I got to know him reasonably well. His father was a Pakistani who joined the Royal Navy. I think he became a petty officer or something of that nature. And he grew up in southwest London. He joined the Harlequins Rugby Club. He was in probably their 7th 15. And he worked his way up. and he was in Panorama. He was never a staff member, and I think that's important to say. I was a staff, a foot soldier for the BBC for 20 years and 3 months.
Right.
He was a freelance. And also, when we're considering this, we ought to consider the man who was the editor of Panorama at the time, Steve Hewlett. Well, he's unfortunately dead, poor man, but there are journalism prizes named after him. And he was in charge of that. And anybody who came to him raising doubts about the methodology and what was in the program and how it had been obtained was told to go away in no uncertain terms in some old-fashioned plain English language. What about him? And it does go right to the top.
Yes.
These emails which have been redacted, the BBC says, well, they're irrelevant. Well, if they are irrelevant, let us make the judgment on that. Let them be discharged, let them be discounted completely. But the matter is so serious for the BBC, it goes to its very heart, to its credibility and to its reputation, that they cannot be plain enough. The damage has been done. Anything that happens now can only make things better.
Yes, exactly right. And I mean, you talk about Martin Bashir being a sort of, quite an ambitious character, nothing particularly wrong with that. But I mean, could there be any truth to what he said, that people were a bit resentful that he had managed to get this interview? Because surely if that was the case, there would have been more of an inquiry as to how he'd managed to do it.
Yeah, in every newsroom there's competition and people watch each other, and healthy competition is absolutely nothing wrong with it. But I'll tell you one thing. I mean, when all this was happening, the BBC rehired him from America, first as religious correspondent, then they promoted him to be religious editor. Well, let me just tell you, on the 20th anniversary of the tragic death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in Paris, he was doing a program. He asked me to give an interview. I went to see him. I was absolutely shocked because he was working not for the BBC. He was working for ABC of America, American Broadcasting Corporation. And I said, Martin, what are you doing here? You're the religious editor of the BBC, and yet you're working for the Americans. He said, shh, shh. And then he later, he knew I was going to a lunch at Broadcasting House for an anniversary of John Simpson. He'd been there for so many years. I was invited to the lunch. And he sent me a memo saying, please don't tell anybody that I was working for ABC. Right. Well, the deceit goes on, doesn't it?
Right. Absolutely right. And I mean, that's the other thing about the BBC, with its current sort of incumbents running it, seems to fall from one scandal to another. You know, I can't remember the last time there was a good story about the BBC, you know, whether it's Gary Lineker, whether it's them trying to put the price of the licence fee up, whether it's about the news department being completely biased towards the conflict in Israel and Gaza. You know, there just seems to be one brickbat after another. It doesn't seem to get any better for them.
Well, you know, I was, one of my last jobs at the BBC was the arts and media correspondent. I think I've got about 14 people doing that job now. I'm just wondering who Tim Davie, the present Director General, who was a marketing man and probably a very good one, but never a journalist, hasn't spent one day in a newsroom in all his life. I'm wondering who he's taking advice from, because it's plain to me and it's plain to you what should be done. And if our counsels had been listened to even a few years ago, perhaps this would not have happened. But it did happen. And the BBC went on covering it up until they could do no more. They had to appoint Lord Dyson. He got into the whole thing, and yet there is more to come. And Andy Webb has made heroic efforts to find out the whole truth of it, not for his own self-aggrandizement at all. It's for the importance, is the integrity and the future of the BBC, which has played a very large part in this country's life for the last 101 years. We deserve the truth. There's no point holding back now. The situation is so bad, it couldn't be worse. Tell the truth. Let's have this much vaunted transparency, which is always talked about. Let's have it here and now on this very important matter.
Yeah, very well said, Michael. Thank you very much indeed. Michael Cole, former BBC royal correspondent.